I think probably the best thing would be to start with what in your life experience led you to sort of become a mental health advocate?
Well, it began in a very practical way, and I think that's the way it's continued, actually. I was the chief executive of a supplementary health benefits company called Liberty Health. And that previously was Ontario Blue Cross, and it became later after that a Manulife company. And at the time, what I began to see was the evidence, the mid to late 90s, the evidence of mental health problems reaching us in a very straggly way, bits and pieces, odd prescriptions, a real trend toward pain and sleep medications being randomly prescribed. Subsequently, I, in association with the Homewood Health Center in Guelph, Ontario, a psychiatric health institution who was a client of mine, we decided to look into that. And I ascertained through some studies being done at Harvard in particular of the growing range of conditions which were affecting mental health, but also they were becoming the greater source of disablement, particularly among men and women in their prime years of work, their 20s, 30s, 40s, early 50s. And there was a shift in the late 90s, early 2000s from life expectancy being the preeminent criterion for the state of health in the world, shifting to the years lived with disability. And the disability was flowing mostly from depression, usually in association with other conditions such as cardiovascular illness, Parkinson's disease, and other chronic conditions. And so I looked into it and I found out there was one thing, which has for me been enemy number one almost my entire life, professionally and personally, is the quality of bullying of those suffering mental disorders on a societal level and one-on-one, that they were taken advantage of, they were shuttled about, they were ignored, they were intimidated, they were treated as people who had no say or no sense. And that motivated me. So with the Honorable Michael Wilson and some other senior business friends, we created a thing called the Business Roundtable on Mental Health. And we decided to try to get corporations more informed, better able to respond to the distress and to the concerns of their people, and to do so on solid business grounds, cost, productive capacity, and to also tie into that the plain, clear-cut humanity factor that required all of us to understand that, number one, all of us are vulnerable to these conditions, no exceptions. And number two, that a lot of the stress and strain that was producing these symptoms were coming from work environments. And that's how we began to launch our initiatives in the early 2000s. And I've been doing that ever since.
What did you said, you talked about it being like something where people were bullied on an individual and on a like sort of at work. And what do you mean? Like, maybe you could go into greater detail about that, what that
Sure.
means.
Well, let's take it back to the 98, 2000 period where that's not so long ago for most people, but it's a long time when you look at the fact that late in the day, so to speak, our society was still shunning those with mental illness. And how that would manifest is that someone would be unable to concentrate on their job, would go to their family doctor and be given a pill or some advice to slow down, you're too stressed, all that kind of thing. But they were not believed at work, that there was something tangibly wrong with them. And that flowed out of the condition that preceded mental illness as the top stigmatized condition called low back pain. And out of that period of time when occupational health and safety was still heavily weighted by the incidence of back pain, it became stigmatized and not believed either. And people were left on disability leave too long and they lost their jobs. They weren't believed at work. They were made fun of. Their own families talked about them as being simply unable to contend with the basic pains of life. The word stress became a label, a moniker. He's stressed out. Yeah, right. There was a term, psychosomatic pain. That was a phrase used frequently in the workers' compensation arena. And it's all in their head, meaning they were imagining the pain in their low back area or in their wrists and joints. And in fact, as it turns out, the reality is that all pain is in your head. All pain derives from the human brain. It is the mediator of all pain with the spinal cord. And we saw clear evidence of this. And as you go back into time, you can see stigmatization of all of the chronic conditions that were unable to be explained by a broken limb or a broken piece of broken skin. Diabetes. People were punished for losing weight so fast. People were left in the closet, figuratively and literally, so the parents didn't have to explain the way they looked because they couldn't eat, they couldn't absorb protein. And you can go right back to history. The further you go, cancer was looked upon as a personal failing. You can find the examples one after the other where unless there's an accident or a temperature that you have been, you've got a fever, unless there's some explanation that's visible, it was hard for people to be believed. And mental illness became that. And it became that associated with certain behaviors, which were assumed to be typical, violent behaviors, walking the streets, hanging around by oneself in a park, being dangerous. All of those were wrong, factually incorrect, but it's what stimulated my interest to try to fix it. And also there was a huge and remains a huge economic cost, which was a strong talking point for us when we interested the big banks and other major employers to take up the cause itself.
What would be something you think that people don't know about mental illness or mental health that they should be made aware of?
First and foremost, it's a physical condition. The word mental really doesn't work. Somehow we have reached the stage where we believe that a person's way of feeling and thinking was their own fault, because if they didn't feel or think that way, they should just stop. So if you're doing that, you must be weak, you must be stupid, you must be selfish, you must be looking for sympathy. And if you talked about taking your own life, you sure were just looking for attention. And when we look at the realities of mental health and mental illness, what we are seeing are very physical molecular dynamics in the human brain that affect the functions of the brain, which creates the thoughts that we live with and often live by. And we should understand that the brain and the body are connected. As recent as 2 days ago, Bruce, I had to explain to somebody that the brain and the body actually work together. This is an informed person in the case management field who said he did not believe that the pain in the back was somehow facilitated by the function of the neurological system. And I had to explain as best I could the connections between brain function and that of the body. And it seemed to me to be both funny, hilarious, and sad all in one grouping that we had to, at this stage of the game, explain it in those terms. The other thing is it's an uninvited condition. It is not assumed by someone because they are behaving in a certain manner. And it's based upon specific elements of brain function that simply get off track.
Are there things that we've learned physiologically and through brain research in recent years that have sort of gleaned a greater understanding of, where things stand with mental health, like
Yeah,
why people suffer from it?
yeah, there's a lot more new information. Um, and one of the things that we have to pay a little bit of attention to without getting too complicated about this, we evolved as human beings with certain features of the way that we became aware of fear, we became aware of danger, we became aware of various kinds of forces around us. And the brain was set up that way. As time passed into the modern age, we no longer had those same threats. But the brain was still seeing threats and feeling threats. Sometimes your self-esteem was the saber-toothed tiger of the eons ago. And it scared you, just like losing that was like losing your life in the face of some wildebeest in the far deep woods. The brain lets you know things are going off track because the brain is really created to do that. And science is telling us now more particularly that if we can understand that we are a communication system in our own right, human beings are a communications device. And I won't get into the ethereal questions or to the meaningful spiritual questions of human life, but within the narrower context of which I'm speaking right now, we are a communication system, and there is all kinds of electricity, molecules, cells going on in here that prompt us to be able to see. I'm looking beyond the set now to the painting across my room. I can see the colors. The brain does that. I can hear the sounds. The brain does that. There's a thing called brain circuits. These are the intersections where information delivered through our eyes, through our ears, and through our senses to the human brain creates the world we perceive. And when science tells us that, they're not telling us some sort of a story impossible to understand. Science is telling us that those systems can be upset in the same way a computer can be upset by the way you handle it. And we have to understand the brain is sensitive to the environment around us. Why, for example, if you remember a film called with Tom Hanks, that he was on an island all by himself. Castaway. And his volleyball floated away.
The famous Wilson scene. Wilson, I'll come back for you. Yeah.
How could a person emotionally get tied to a volleyball? Because for him, that was something that he held close to him, and it became attached to his sense of reality. He had no one else to talk to, so he created a relationship with an inanimate object, and the brain will do that. If someone is alone and they're talking to themselves, you know, the old story of the poor old man living on the hill talking to himself. That's quite natural, frankly, because the brain will invent its own reality if it's left alone and left isolated for too long a period of time. And those are natural things which we look upon as kind of crazy. But the brain is a dynamic, vital, 10-pound organ that is connected to the way our heart functions, connected to the way our immune system functions, affects the quality of our blood flow. And when it's upset by what's going on, through fear, frustration, loss of self-esteem, tremendous pressure born in the pandemic of loss, of the fear of loss, your home, your security. Saw a young woman being forced out of her home to live in a car with her 3-year-old child. That fear of that sort of thing is as intense and deep as it can get. And her capacity to see through it and to be able to retain her protective and loving care of her child while living in her car was something that she showed great courage. She finally found a way back into the house, but it took some doing to make sure the bank was at least aware that she couldn't survive the way they had hoped without any support. So they gave her the support. We have a wonderful system that just goes off the rails from time to time. And that's the basic premise that we have to understand. That's at work here. We're all vulnerable to it. Everyone, no exceptions, none.
That's something that I actually want to pick up on, because I think that's one of the things that I find interesting, is that our world is changing. And a lot of the connections that we once had, for example, through religious institutions, community, they've kind of, they've diminished, and there's been a secularization of society and a change. And even within family dynamics, at one time you had large families, so siblings would be a big part of your life. And now things are a lot more isolated. You have a lot more single child families, and you have single parent families. And I think that leads to greater isolation. How do you see that playing as a part in this?
I see it as relevant to the question of how we conduct ourselves running organizations or looking after a family, because isolation is an abnormal state for a human being. Not that we all don't like to be alone from time to time. I know I do. And some people love to be alone more than others. But that's different than, quote, isolation. Loneliness is different than so-called isolation. Isolation is when your connection to the normal stimulus of the world and other people has dried up. And that will happen with someone who's been laid off work for the first time. One of the great sources of distress in the loss of employment, aside from the financial and the risks that one faces to keep above water, is things like seeing daytime television for the first time and realizing you're home alone in the middle of the day, and you suddenly have this sense of worthlessness, and it sweeps you up into a state where your mind is saying you're not worth anything, actually, as it turns out, are you, Bill? Why are you here? That means you're a failure. And there's a tragic story, which I was part because I was responding to the family, that the father left the plant having been fired, laid off. They walked him through the office so that people are all sort of looking at him, such. Went home, 11 o'clock in the morning. By 4 o'clock, he was in such a state of mind, went into the basement, found a rope and hanged himself. Gone. His child comes home, his son, adopted son, and before his mother, and finds his father in that state. The son and the father were close. Kid is now 9. And at first, the wife, the mother, is angry at the father for doing this, knowing the child would probably be the one to find him, given their pattern of the coming and going of the family. So I had a long chat with them, and they said, what can we do? I got to make sure this boy doesn't grow up looking at his father as the failure his father had decided he himself had become because he lost his job. I got in touch with the mayor of the community, found out that the father was a Big Brother, active in the Big Brother movement. And the mayor, God bless him, dedicated a park bench to the memory of this man and put a beautiful little plaque on that park bench extolling his virtues for his active participation in helping young boys. The young son saw that, started to bring his friends to that bench to see, that's my dad. The dad turned around and, having died, became in this child's memory. 15 years later, I get an email a month ago. The kid is now in university. I still go to the park bench, Bill, because I have something to remind me my dad was worth it. And what we've all got to remember is brother to brother, sister to brother, husband and wife, friends, strangers who care and need to care for each other even though we don't know each other from Adam or Eve, have to understand that a person's self-worth is everything. Everything. No matter how their life has gone, an addict under the influence of a drug ultimately must rediscover their self-worth to have a chance. And self-worth, self-esteem, self-understanding, self-awareness sounds like a fuzzy psychological idea, but it's everything to the success of a human being to live a life that's worth living.
I wonder how the role of resiliency plays into this. Like one of the things that's been discussed over the last 10 or so years is that the latest generation, the millennials, tend to be less resilient. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that: family dynamics, smaller families. You have parents championing their child, and helicopter parents. Where do you see the role of resiliency working into this equation?
Oh, well, I think it's a very important quality to make sure anyone, especially early in life, can develop and use. But at the same time, you've got to know how to fuel that thing called resilience. There's a fine balance between looking at life and bouncing back no matter what happens without any afterthought. That's probably not what we mean by resilience. After a while, I don't care about other things. I know I can get out from under. So it's a balancing act between caring about something you've done, something that's been done to you, something that's happened. How do you get over the natural and unnatural obstacles of life? It's back to this business of who am I? Why am I? And for those who will see this interview, some will have lost a family member to suicide. The story I just told you is one example of the aftermath. But the question is always why? What happened? Or why did that person suddenly not have the gumption to carry on? Why did they lack the resilience? It all comes back to understanding you have value, that I have a place and I have things to do that are worthwhile. Don't have to be famous, don't have to be a hero, but useful, productive, and reasonably okay with things. And then when you can keep in proportion the things that hit you, that's one form of resilience. And to see it, I can master this. And when there is a serious obstacle, the loss of a job, the loss of a family member, the loss of something very dear to you, the resilience takes the form of the ability to manage the extended burden into the future. And that becomes, again, self-awareness. Can I do it? Yes, I can, because I must. Yes, I can, because I know who I am, and I've got the ability to do that. It's a learnable skill. It's a teachable skill. And it's a balancing act, because too much or too little is not enough, or it's too much. And a person has a different attitude than was intended.
So it sounds like what we need to put in place is some sort of framework, so that, because people are going to lose jobs, and you can't just say, well, no one's ever going to lose their job again. Yeah. People are going to have loss in their lives, and it's going to affect them. So it sounds like you would like to see some sort of framework put in place so that people have support systems should they suffer some sort of loss.
Yeah, and I think that the 3 or 4 qualities of mind that are often the most troubled when they're upset, distressed, are fear of loss, frustration, rumination, and anger can get out of hand. And when we look at how do we help people deal with life, we also have to come back to 2 other factors that play into this invariably. One is what we're predisposed to. we inherit certain proclivities, certain ways of reacting to events. That is the inheritable genetic aspects of life, and they exist. But they are not dominant. People say I inherited something. Most cases, except for certain neurological conditions like Huntington's or Alzheimer's, where the genetic inheritance is really significant. Most conditions of a mental nature are predominantly things that we can manage and get over if we have a lifelong ability to learn what we can contain and what we've got to work hard to overcome, and not to be bewildered by the changes hitting us. Balance, balance, balance. And it's something that we've all been taught a million times, everything in moderation. Unfortunately, when it comes to mental disorders, a lot of the pressure is both uninvited and unmanageable for the individual for a considerable period of time, which is why they become distressed and in some cases unable to do their jobs, unable to go to work, unable to function in a manner that's for them the normal way of getting through the day.
You said earlier that you talked about how the brain is connected to the body, and that's something that a lot of people understand. Is there anything else that you think the average person perhaps doesn't fully appreciate about mental disorders and poor mental health?
Yeah, I think basically people have a hard time comprehending, and why wouldn't you, how these things happen to a person. And if it's not, people get the idea of genetic inheritance, as we just discussed, and that's a good enough explanation, except we know it's not enough to explain schizophrenia, for example. Schizophrenia is only 1% of the population, but it's a devastating condition. Why does that happen to this child and not that child?
Mm.
And brain function, in my opinion, the human brain is a part of us we have never allowed ourselves to learn about and to understand. If you think about all the great songs and poetry and artistic manifestations, we talk about the heart. You got to have heart. It's the name of a song. That horse that won the race did it because that animal had a lot of heart. The heart is a pump. It has nothing whatever to do with courage. It's a great metaphor. And we go through life thinking the heart is everything in those regards. Courage comes from in here. Fear comes from within here. The brain has been swept away in our society and the process of learning about ourselves by religion, for one thing, because the churches have always been, right back to the earliest hours of organized religion, have always discouraged people from thinking things through too much and to understanding where thoughts come from, as opposed to what we should believe in terms of blind faith. And anybody who gets mad at me for saying those things, believe me, I'm not anti-religion by any means, but that's the facts of the matter. We haven't learned enough about what's between our ears. The brain exists. It's about this big. It's complex beyond comprehension. It has billions of cells that have billions of connections to other cells. And it's the thing, if you can imagine designing something that can do this for you. I'm looking at my computer now, and there you are. You're in a blue sweater or shirt. The background is a brown wall made of wood, a lovely picture painted by your sister. Over here is my wall, and over here is there. I see my red sweater. Think about a brain that every one of those things I just mentioned is performed by a different part of the human brain. And it takes all that information coming in through my eyes, putting it together and telling me that's what I see, and here I am. And that's why this business people hear about consciousness being impossible to understand. Well, rightly so, because we don't quite comprehend how human beings function this way. But we could have spent a lot more time early in life, later in life, understanding what the brain does, instead of trying to find out what the soul did or does for us, thinking that's another entity there. And they call this the legacy of René Descartes, who was a famous scientist in France, where he nearly got excommunicated by the Pope of the day in the 1500s for saying he wanted to do brain research. And the church said, no, you can't do that, because we'll take care of the brain. You look after the rest of yourself.
Mm.
So we got to know more about what's in here. Young people growing up should understand better what's here, where their thoughts come from, what their motivation, where does it come from, what makes me do some things and not other things. This should be a fundamental precept of a basic knowledge. It's not that we expect you to understand brain surgery, as they say, but in fact, how and why we function the way we do.
Isn't one of Descartes' famous sayings, I think, therefore I am. And I wonder how many young people go through an existence, their early existence, not really understanding who they are. And in those formative years, they develop patterns of behavior that are hard to shake for the rest of their lives. And I think I can imagine that, there are things where if you had a difficult home environment, some abuse, child abuse, drug abuse in your daily life, that would cause damage to your self-esteem, to how you perceive the world, how you perceive your parents, other adults. These are all things that have a huge impact going forward from that point. I imagine that what you'd be looking at is something where people could understand sort of a metacognition of what's going on in their lives, and sort of develop an awareness of, oh, I'm going through something that not everyone else is going through, and I may need to work that out at some point.
Right. I think that's a very good way to sum it up. You mentioned child abuse. The clinical studies are now pretty conclusive that early childhood adversity in the form of child abuse, sexual abuse, fear of being thrown out on the street with your parents, parents at war with each other, fear of not having a shelter, fear of all the basics going away, fear of a street where the gangs are more prevalent than any other group. Those things will develop over time to produce a multiple of suicides among adults, derivative of the way in which they developed over the years, with that early childhood adversity shaping their way that they think of things and the way that they perceive danger. And I really believe that child abuse, from a societal point of view, should be a lot more serious crime than we currently treat it as, because it has a lifelong effect. What we've also begun to know is that mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder take almost a lifetime to manifest in symptoms, the way you feel about it. Most times, most people, 70 to 75% of people who develop depression in their 30s remember experiences when they were 8 or 9. That looking back, they said, I bet. And there will be a fairly preponderant number of people like that, with that experience, that is. But I think that what we simply have to learn is, I'm doing an analysis right now of how to prevent mental disorders. And there's 3 big components. Sure, there's certain things individuals can do. Eating right can affect your mental health. Famines are known to produce schizophrenia 2 generations later. Brain has developed in a certain manner. But more importantly to me right now is, how do we prevent these conditions from manifesting? And what kids are vulnerable for what reasons? Lots of good stuff going on right now with regard to the kinds of traits a teenager has developed that makes them more likely to take drugs in excess, or alcohol, take drugs or alcohol in excess. We also have to understand that the way that our institutions behave produced tons of risk. The way that banks behave, example is a thing called the property tax sale of someone's home, where they are in arrears in their municipal taxes, and the municipality, quite literally, will just send out the notice it's for sale. I got a situation in New Brunswick tonight where this couple just got this thing in the paper, in the mail rather. That is an unnecessary cruelty. In the middle of the pandemic, the superintendent of financial institutions told all the banks they could no longer treat delinquent loans from small business or individuals as good loans on their books, simply to look the other way during the pandemic. That time was up. You had to treat them as delinquent, which meant the banks had to go all back to the small business or to the individual and start to punish them for it. That was another example of an institutional decision that was cruel. Layoffs, sure, they're going to happen, but when they're done on a mass basis in response to shareholder value, it's a corrupt decision. There's no such thing as shareholder value born of the fact you've mismanaged the business. You, the manager, the people have done their job. The managers have mismanaged, and I'm a manager, and I'm an executive, and I'm a capitalist, and I say these things. If you look at the church and the abuse of children, the Catholic Church, that to me is a criminal organization. The damage done by that range of offending practices has not only put kids in the ground, it's put today adults in permanent distress. So institutional behavioral health and the leadership decisions, the policies and practices, for me, are going to be target number one when it comes to preventing the development and onset of conditions that take a lifetime to really manifest, except in rare cases. And it's not going to, it doesn't mean we have to tear down our communities and our economic systems at all. The adjustments will be fairly modest. And that means some degree of lifetime security within reason, some degree of pride and fulfillment in your work, regardless of the functions you perform, and a good, healthy degree of self-respect born of the respect shown you by others. Sounds like everyday stuff, but it's crucial. It's life and death stuff for some, believe me.
So I think one of the ways that can be facilitated is through, a greater sense of community. If people had the ability to see themselves as part of something bigger and feel a connection. So like one of the things I think of is, and I wanted to go back because I think it's fascinating. You were talking about, children and how, they have experiences in their youth that take a long time to manifest, and they manifest down the road. And, I think one of the things that I've always imagined that if you could wave a magic wand or snap your fingers and end child abuse, you would down the road, and things like petty crimes, petty thefts, drug abuse would all take a drastic fall, because those things originate out of child abuse. Sure. And one of the things that I'm worried about is that, something that's particularly pernicious right now is the effect of social media, and how this incredibly distant and abstract relationship with the world is affecting our young people. And I'm concerned that children aren't getting genuine connection. They're having this sort of remote connection to the world. And interestingly enough, it's not simply an equitable relationship. It's inequitable. They're seeing the existence of others out there in this ethereal world as being somehow better than their own. And it actually is affecting their self-esteem. They don't like their life because their life is not as glamorous or as sophisticated as this life they see out. And I see this particularly having a huge impact on young women, young adolescent women. They have a huge difficulty with this. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I would be on the same wavelength as you on that. matter. I think this is a manifestation of bullying on a whole different scale. I also am looking into how does technology get designed so finitely to addict people, such as cigarettes were designed that way years ago. And these technologies are not becoming addictive by accident. Neuroscientific knowledge is in play, which means neuroscientists are involved. And I'd like to know who they are. That's point one. The second point is with regard to the child, is the second string ball player. If you played sports, and I believe you did, you said, there is nothing worse than being the second stringer. The kid who doesn't get into the game until late when the decision is made, the game's almost over, the score is lopsided or something. And they have things to offer, but they never get a chance because they're second string. Well, that's how the whole generation of young kids are being treated now on such a scale as being kind of the second string in life, that they are by definition sitting in the back of the bench if this was a sports team. And I think that has everything to do with the instincts of bullying. I think that is at the heart of it, is the tendency to use these systems to pick on people and to demonstrate superiority over others. And by that, I think it doesn't even have to be hard-edged, it can be subtle, but if over time it's consistently present, you're making someone feel not worth it, it'll take its toll. I really believe that it's going to sound like an ancient guy living in the past, but I think we've reached a point where there's at least now one technology that truly is proving to be harmful to society. I think technology always brings out, this is going to kill us, this is going to hurt us. And most of it hasn't up to now, at least the way that we hope. But I think this stuff has, because it seems to be a life of its own. I did a report 2 years ago, we're updating, called Mental Health in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. There's a community of technologists now working that don't talk about people anymore. They talk about sentient beings. That's their conversation. Well, there's one brain, the artificial brain, and then there's the sentient brain, which is the human person that is supposed to be in that workplace. When you become that casual about equating the technology, the intelligence of technology with the intelligence of a human being, and therefore the merits and value of either, we're reaching a stage where it's probably going to have to be attended to. I don't think government will solve this. I think it's got to come mostly through educators, parental action, an understanding that you can't just leave the handheld device with the kid 24 hours a day. You got to monitor and manage it like anything else. But you're in the educational field, and I think it certainly is something that would be important for kids to learn, why they feel edgy when they're not looking at this thing. There's a reason for that, and it has to do with Mr. Brain. And there are certain very particular elements of the human brain that rely upon routine, especially the kind that gives them some kind of a kick. And that's what this stuff becomes. I think it's a dangerous, regrettable thing created by people who, all of whom, certainly in the major companies, were themselves isolated people. Think who designs, who sits down and designs software and algorithms is someone who works alone. and that's good if that's what you want. But when you put a person in the position who is a kid, 14 years old, grade 7 or 8 or 9, whatever that is, and you draw them into that alone place, which they're looking at a world between them and it, with all this going on that forms the basis of self-evaluation and self-awareness. We're doing something worse than it used to be when we allowed kids to smoke almost. It's probably not as bad, not worse of, but certainly as bad as. And that to me is the degree to which we should turn on this. We should turn on it societally. It should be led by parents and educators and business people and leaders in the community. And it should be something we agree to do because it'll save lives.
I think one of the things in particular that I see is that a big problem is that a lot of the algorithms are designed to create confirmation bias, and that you channel a child one way or an adolescent a certain way, and you give them everything they see confirms what they're thinking. And I think what really gets hurt there is critical thinking skills. And I think we have a lot of people who are unable to examine the world around them fairly, and they tend to look at something and they see it through a lens, and it would be good to broaden that lens and allow them to, instead of telling them what to think or teaching them what to think, teach them how to think so that they actually can expand their view of the world. And I think this is one of the things about social media and even technology in general, is that we tend to be pointing someone in a direction and pushing them down this hallway instead of allowing them to explore the world in an open way. I think that's
I think I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
To the point you made earlier is that what these behaviors do is tap into predilection or predisposition towards certain weaknesses. We all have that. And we're inclined in certain directions by definition of who we are, how we've lived, where we live, with whom we live, how we were brought up, the genetic formulations that are part of our human existence. And this stuff takes us down that hallway you mentioned and makes us alone while we're dealing with the complexities of a kid growing up, increasingly deepening the fact that that kid's supposed to figure it out on their own. And to me, this is something that should be addressed pretty thoroughly, because kids will get caught in the trap and then never come out.
Mm. So how do you think we move from awareness to action? Like where do we find our next steps? How do we go from, because I think we all have a greater awareness of the various aspects of mental health and how they impact on all aspects of our life. But how do we put into action changes that will be manifest in our daily lives and will have a huge impact on how we live?
Well, and I could say there's some things that have happened over the years that have made a big improvement. We're not starting from scratch on mental health and mental disorder as we were 20 years ago. Workplaces now have programs. Workplaces now have tools to reduce chronic stress. And managers are being retrained to ensure that employees are not belittled, are not harassed. There's still exceptions to the rule, obviously. But there is a big improvement in the quality of life in workplaces. Somewhere, sometimes, and always the exception to the rule, though, is indicates we've not done enough, not good enough. Chronic job stress is enemy number one. We must reduce that, and we must build job fulfillment into the employment contract. That must be part of the employer's responsibility. You can measure it and make every job not just a paycheck and not just a living, but in fact a fulfilling exercise. And it can happen. I've spoken with multiples of government departments in the last 6 months as they got ready for the immigration crisis. They knew it was coming. And for people to work in government, they must get a picture that this is that their work, the harassment of their work, not of their boss, but the flood of demand on their time and where nothing seems to get done quickly enough, is being done on behalf of Canadians. So they're fulfilled by the difficulties of their job are not overwhelmingly negative, it's because they're working on behalf of Canadians. And fulfillment helps you bear the burden of too long at the job, morning, noon, and night, frustration, things don't work as they're supposed to, bosses don't hear you enough. We've got to repeat this again around the circle. Plus, and this is going to be important for the artificial intelligence world, we got to reaffirm that the human being is the principal asset of the company. We have now the data to say it is, the economic and financial data to say that people count more than things. We have two statistics. One is that intangibles, which is what accountants call people, represent about 80% of the asset value of publicly traded companies in this country today. That's a complete turnaround, almost invisible to the public eye. And Brookfield Assets Management, a premier company that has done a couple of remarkable things. They have actually put a dollar value on the work being done by their people day to day. Some are administrative and clerical, some are strategic, working directly with assets and clients from which they derive their revenue. But they have shown that the clerical and administrative person has a dollar value that helps the others to succeed. And they've now put that dollar value on these people. And you might say, well, people are worth more than money. Human capital is a combination of human qualities, human skills, and dollar value. And once you put a dollar value on it, those people don't get laid off at the stroke of a pen next time, because you now can quantify the assets you're throwing out the window. You wouldn't take all your hard equipment and get rid of it to please the shareholders. You shouldn't do that with the people as well. The other thing is we must understand and get a better handle, and this is government and science and business as employers and as delivering part of the healthcare system. We must understand that mental disorders complicate other chronic conditions, heart disease, diabetes, cancer recovery. And it's not just a mood thing where I don't take my medication or I'm feeling bad, so my health goes down. There's a physiological dynamic going on. Mental disorders are influenced by and deliver inflammation in the human body. It thickens the blood, therefore contributes to arrhythmia, principal cause of heart attack. It interferes with recovery from wounds and infectious disease, enhances the risk of getting the infection from another, i.e. COVID. So why do I say that? This is insoluble. It's not, it's soluble. These are soluble things, and these can be fixed, which means that a part of our prevention analysis is going to say every major chronic condition should be accompanied by treatments of a mental health nature. Your diabetes specialist should have a mental health specialist. Your diabetes person, your victim, the person living with diabetes, should be aware of the links to depression and make sure it's evaluated and assessed for that purpose. We can triple the capacity of care if we assign mental health dimensions to every other part of the healthcare system, which we don't do today. We can do that. And that will save lives, and it will also reduce the incidence and the prevalence of these conditions. And finally, we must find a way, and again, we'll be commenting on this, to look after kids. It's hard to comprehend, but it's true, the degree to which our healthcare system does not accommodate children's emergencies, except if you go to an emergency ward, you may get something done there. But there's no specialized treatment for kids on a routine basis. And we're bringing children and young people together across the country in a series of youth roundtables, started in Atlantic Canada. We're doing Ontario next Saturday and moving west to talk about how their mental health services in their community affects them and helps them. The government is open now to hearing about this stuff because they're not looking for criticism, but they are looking for improvements. And finally, I really believe that, back to what I said earlier, if we don't learn more about what the brain is and isn't on a rudimentary, fundamental, everyday basis, we're going to keep struggling with why people are what they are and do what they do. And there should be a lot less mystery about that.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's funny because what you were saying earlier. I really, I was thinking about how, in an odd way, the way work was structured in the post-war period. You would join a company, you would take a career, and you
Yeah.
might work your way through that company over time. And
Right.
in a sense, your worth as an individual, your worth as a worker
Yeah.
changed, evolved over time. And you had a commitment to that firm, and the firm had a commitment to you.
Correct.
And now with contract work being much more prevalent, that relationship has become a lot different. That is not a long range, it's not a long-term view of that individual as a worker, because everyone concedes that, well, this person isn't going to be with us forever. And I think that, while there are people for whom that is an important value, they want to be able to move from one job to another. There are other people that I think would want that connection. They would want that sustained relationship with their employer and going forward. And I think it's interesting that what you describe almost harkens back to another age, because if you had a job where you came in as a member of, say, the custodial staff, that there might be programs involved in that line of work that would lead you into other jobs, other aspects of that line of work, and maybe into a career, and thus improving your relationship with your job and making it more meaningful. It's interesting that we've kind of moved away from that.
Yeah, and it has certainly eroded trust, or the reverse, trust eroded, created this, I want greater distance, I don't know, but it began, how late was it? It was certainly in the late 90s at the very latest. Maybe it was later than that, actually, where General Electric and IBM both laid off people for the first time in their history. You think about that.
Mm.
You were lifelong employees for that company until the mid to late 90s. And they had an attitude toward their people that was more familial, but what happened is mergers and acquisitions based upon share exchange began to define the basis upon which large organizations measured their progress in terms of wealth. And chief executives started to get 30–40% of their compensation through share and value and targets. Consequently, companies started to lay off people in order to monetize, for their purposes, the reduction of overhead costs. Well, in fact, they didn't do that. That was a pretense. They took stuff off the balance sheet, less headcount cost, but it appeared on the income statement, which meant that it was still being taken off, deducted from what the earnings were about. And I've done that as a president and chief executive of a company. I've laid off people almost because I wanted to get a message across that we couldn't continue to function in a certain way. And I'm not proud of that, but neither am I of a mind to say that certain times require certain measures for the health of the organization, but not today. The layoffs that have gone on, where CIBC announced months in advance it was going to lay off 4,000 people. Months in advance.
Mm.
And what that meant for all of us, or at least certainly the employees, is living with that uncertainty for all that time. And that, again, is a form of, however benign one might see it, it's a form of cruelty. And we don't have to draw blood to be cruel. We can draw and excavate spirit and hope. And that's a form of cruelty that takes as great a toll as many other forms.
Earlier in the conversation, you used the example, you drew on the example of an individual who had been at work and lost his job and then eventually committed suicide. Why is it you think people actually have become so despondent that they they turn to suicide, they seek end their lives. Why do you think that is?
I think it's hard to say, but because I've dealt with a lot of families. I'm not a clinician. I don't try to explain away, but just over the years, for some reason, because my name is out there for one thing, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of families about what to do in the aftermath of. I don't think it's hard to see how, if your sense of who you are and why you are is diminished to the point where you think you now have no value, you find a way to say, I can't live with that prospect or that idea. I just can't do it. Other people just run out of steam. There's a little boy who, this is a hard one to even hear about, little 12-year-old kid in Cobourg, Ontario. He completed suicide by way of wrapping a sheet around his neck and sliding down the side of the bed. And that's not hanging, that's strangulation. And the only note he left for his mother was, I've just made the bed. And he was laying on the side when she found him. So I went to the funeral arrangements, and we talked, and the family, of course, was beside itself. And what and why. And the only why that was possible in their minds was that his experience at school had gone badly. He was no longer getting good marks, and he was also being excluded from his friends. And he felt, she thought, completely isolated from anything and everybody that gave him anything to go on as to who and why he was, which I think is as good an assessment as you can do. But my view of it all is that for those families who are survivals of this kind of experience, the best way to deal with it, it's not the easiest way, because there's nothing easy about any of it, is to recognize the things that that person brought value to in their life, like the park bench with the plaque, like the child who got good marks for everything except 6 months at school, for the good deeds done by a mother who was the chief financial officer of a family business who decided that she was too tired to carry on. They do things as human beings and as family members that are worth celebrating. And we mustn't have the memory of people who take their own life left in the ditch. We can't allow ourselves as family members or as members of the public to recognize, because this decision, which is often infected by a decision that's off the cuff, right up to the moment of the act, the person may turn away from it, right to the very second. And it's a final impulse that takes place in the final moments or seconds of their life. And we must help all of us understand that this decision is not a decision of being a selfish person. It's a decision of desperation. It's a decision of weariness with life. And it's a decision in some cases that I'm better off and my family's better off without me. And I've also dealt with insurance companies, because most insurance policies have a certain exclusion of suicide for payment of life insurance. And I'm working with somebody now to try to get that changed. But the why is, I think, nearly impossible to find. But what I have misunderstood and minimized my entire life is the value, the importance of the value we put on ourselves. I'm important, therefore I'm an egomaniac. I'm important, but I shouldn't say that. Sure, probably not. I'm important, therefore someone else isn't as important as me. Those are the counter forces. And so I'm thinking that one of the other things, and in education with younger kids, is to understand, as the great neuroscientist and Nobel Prize winner Eric Kandel said, self-awareness is not self-congratulation. It is understanding what you're best at, what you want to be best at. It means you can look to the left and talk to someone there. Look to the I just did left to right. To the right, and you can have someone there, and to the left, someone there. That you can talk to someone bigger than you or smaller than you. And most of all, you can see a place for yourself. And once you find the place, you find the purpose. And I think fundamentally, I wish I had learned that lesson a long time ago, because I didn't. And it's only since I got involved in mental health stuff. And with mental health, mental disorders, suicide, and the fear of Alzheimer's, which is another apprehension that's hard to quantify, is that it's about the most fundamental aspects of being a human being. You know, the scientists at the Robarts Institute in London, Ontario, told me once, schizophrenia is the only disease known to medicine that is exclusively owned by human beings, because the failure of the brain to know what is real and not real, which is one of the elements of this, is uniquely human. And if we ever crack schizophrenia, we may crack consciousness. That those who live with schizophrenia could in fact be the harbors of the answers to mental illness, because in something that works not correctly shows more about how it should be working. And the scientists one day, I think, will solve a lot of these problems when they find out what causes schizophrenia, because it goes right to what they call the binding problem. Remember before I told you about the colors and the shapes, and your mind can bind it together into a picture of reality. If you have schizophrenia, it can't do that. And that's the essence of consciousness. Profound stuff when you think of it in terms, I think, of potential. And it's hard because it's the human brain. You can't take it out of someone's head and look at it. You got to find a way. You can see these conditions now, you know, they're different colors. That's the other part. These are not invisible. You asked earlier, what should people know? Depression is greenish blue. And you see it on an MRI, a functional MRI, it says different colors. Your brain is shades of color in right behind your forehead. Anxiety comes from the back part of your brain. Schizophrenia is a couple of things in here. The cells relevant to all of these conditions in terms of inheritance overlap among all these conditions, and it's the only diseases where that happens. Complexity, you bet, but it's very close to the defining features of being a human being, is when we understand mental health and those distressors that intrude and interfere with it. That's the human.
Because I look back and I have this tendency to look at things historically, and when you look back at some of the adversity that we overcame in the 20th century, the Great Depression, the World Wars, and suicide was never as high as it is now in those time periods. And you wonder what, you talk about the young man who felt that he had been unsuccessful at school, and he had decided to commit suicide at a very young age. And I wonder how much the pressure we've put on children through having smaller family units, putting a great deal of pressure on them through parenting, parents taking a huge part in their daily lives and not having those strong connections with a large group of people. I imagine when you were young, you had opportunity where you would say goodbye to your parents for the day and you'd be off playing with your friends the whole day.
And you play outside as a kid on your own. But,
right.
But here again, if I may just throw this in, the thing I try to underscore to people, and I'm not an original expert on any of this. I've been doing it now for 24 years. And God bless the scientists and the clinicians and the experts who have tutored me and briefed me all over the world and told me what they know and what they don't know. It's helped me become a translator, and I'm kind of a reporter. That's the way I see myself on this various stuff. But I really think the point I made a second ago is the one that lingers in my mind every time I think about matters of this nature, is that what am I now? What was I 6 months ago and 6 years ago and 50 years ago? And what will I be next week and 3 weeks from now? And none of that, the past doesn't have to matter as much as it does for a lot of us. And the future has to be can be less ominous or worrisome or querulous. You know, what are you going to do with me, future? If we here and now think, yeah, by and large, I've been okay. I know what I can do. I know what I like to do. I know who I like, and I know what I'm with the people I like, and my family is that, or my friends are that. It's that equilibrium that we've lost in my judgment, the last 20 years. And that equilibrium has produced layoffs in business that were uncalled for. And that has unsettled our economy and unsettled our population. StatsCan will tell you that the great layoffs of the 90s, number one, did not improve productive capacity within those companies or in the economy. And secondly, worsened the efficiencies because it took out the middle of these companies where the real work was being done. And I think we've lost track. That's what I think we've done. And I think it shows up in listening to government today, where their speeches are imprecise, but highly, highly emphatic about their own consistency or the commitments they make. But if you listen enough in this Glasgow meetings, it wasn't about what we've done, it's about what we're going to do and the promises we're going to make, and the idea that we've got to do better. And that's good enough today. But the actual doing somehow slips through our fingers. And I think that shows up in the frustration of people with institutions increasingly.
I'm thinking about, where we are right now with COVID, and COVID has presented so many challenges in so many regards, in terms of the impact it's had, and cross culturally, across our societal impacts. But I think it would be tough to argue that it has had a greater impact on anyone than it has on people who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic status. And and so if you're living and working in a job which is perhaps in the service industry, or it's a lower income job, then this has been a very difficult time, because you're either someone who has been expected to, either through working at a grocery store, or in public service, or whether it's in public health, you've been expected to be on the job, and you've been continuing. You have people who are working the supply chain, truckers who've been continuing working, and yet in those situations you have your children perhaps unable to go to school, and there's been a lot of pressure there. And yet a lot of the decisions have been made by people who are in a different circumstance. They can work from home, they can be with their children. And I think that's that kind of pressure must be tremendous on their home environment, and must have a devastating effect on people's mental health. What are your thoughts?
I look at the certain politicians, not so much in Canada, but elsewhere, the disregard and the cruelty they demonstrated to people who, if they didn't go to work, they wouldn't get paid. So how could they not go to work in the middle of a pandemic? And weren't going to give them any help. Eventually the help came, but it came late and it came bureaucratically. What my favorite politician of all time was Bill Davis, the former Premier of Ontario. And I knew him very well. And he passed away, as you know, a couple of months ago. And he had such an understated way. People would say, it must be hard exercising power. And he says, I don't exercise power. I meet responsibilities. And when I see someone hurting, I don't give them a helping hand. That's my job. I give them the help they deserve and need and merit. So he was always looking at it is that I serve them. That's not them sort of bowing toward me. Politicians, a lot of them, I've been involved in a lot of politics, 3 levels of government, chief of staff, Toronto. And the best politicians, Paul Godfrey, another one, our former Metro chairman, Art Eckleton, the mayor I worked for, all these guys didn't see their role in politics as some sort of a throne they sat on while people came and presented. They saw it as a job they had to do for those people. And that's why they stayed healthy, mentally and emotionally in the jobs they were in, why they eventually saw that it was time to go. They didn't fight elections for the sake of win at all costs. They fought, well, I'd like to win, but I don't have to destroy anybody getting there. And that has been lost in our public life today. It's a vicious circle for so many people, and jobs have been, and politics have become an employment source for certain people. So it's, yeah, the only other thing I'd say about the pandemic in this context is that I hope it doesn't cloud the fact that chronic disorders will continue to be the principal health issue facing the world. And pandemics will happen again. We should have been better prepared for this one. I hope we will for the next. But this was like a hurricane or a tsunami across a barren land, taking everything down with it with no preventive or mitigating system. I remind everyone I can think of is 10 years from now, if there's not another pandemic between now and then, good Lord, we're grateful. The problems of heart disease, diabetes, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, arthritis will remain principal health issue number 1.
I'm thinking as you speak, I'm thinking about how, we have a lot of things that we understand about mental health, but there are probably things that we haven't asked ourselves. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about questions that you think need to be asked of, public health, for example, with the reaction to COVID. Should they be taking into account people's mental health when making public health decisions, taking a longer range view of the individual during these times rather than a very tight focus. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that. Or what have we not explored? What do we need to think of differently?
Yeah, and I think that's a great and appropriate question, because a health minister of 1975, Mark Lalonde, who's still with us at age 92 or 3, wrote a paper in 75 in which he said we shouldn't just design an acute care system. We should design a system that can do the acute care, but also has prevention, education, and learning tied in. And the government of the day did not respond to that, and he couldn't get it done or didn't follow up, one or the other. And that's where we're at today. We have a barren healthcare system in terms of intellectual capacity for innovation, and we have a system based upon preventable accidents, injuries, and diseases, mostly preventable. In the United States, something like 75% of the beds in hospitals are occupied by people with preventable conditions. So I think the big change has got to come in taking the system and integrating it. It's a terribly fragmented system right now. I don't think pharmacare is necessarily essential. I'm not sure it will do any good. So I hope they don't sort of distract themselves with that. I think we should have a chronic health, chronic care system fundamentally. I think we should have a system that is woven together by need, not by professional discipline and designations made by the professionals themselves. I think family physicians should work closely with psychologists and both be paid through the healthcare system. I think family physicians are unequipped to deal with a lot of what they're faced with, and they'll agree with that. Certainly in the case of mental health, family physicians are uncomfortable contending with these conditions. Psychiatrists is a profession, in my opinion, psychiatry that should be, if not abandoned or rendered obsolete, it should be ordered, repurposed, because it's medical doctors with a little bit of extra training, 3 years or so. And right today, you have the psychologist who is covered by private insurance, the psychiatrist, public insurance, the psychologist, talk therapy, the psychiatrist, drugs, medications. Neither of them much in rural Canada at all. So I think we need a reconceptualization of healthcare around need, the integration of specialized knowledge so that it isn't rarefied, cardiovascular illness, more deaths due to depression are caused through heart disease than through suicide. So we've got a big chance and a big opportunity. The government recently appointed a federal minister of mental health. I think that's kind of irrelevant. The main thing is we got to look at the healthcare system as something that's run its course, and don't be afraid of re-examining it by saying, oh, we're going to fall into the American model. Right now, we have no-tier healthcare, not two-tier healthcare in mental health care. We don't have a system, and it's killing people. So I'm all in favor of change on that scale, and I think it's doable. It doesn't have to be painful to professionals. It can be incorporating mental health into absolutely every dimension of specialized healthcare services. If I go to Toronto General, which I did to have a stent put in my heart, I should also be screened for depression. That's happening now at the Montreal Heart Institute and the Ottawa Heart Institute, where they had two innovators who started that a long time ago. Same case with diabetes. Diabetes is all over the map with regard to its interface and integration with other chronic illnesses. I have a thing called the depression matrix, showing depression and all these chronic conditions it influences and is influenced by. And this means truly that the systemic nature of the human being is what we're talking about here. Not one bruise at a time or one incision at a time or one organ at a time, but a holistic system with an integrated range of services that are perhaps all specialized or less specialized as case may need, but are all integrated in their delivery and their access to each other. We have the technology. We could put family medicine pretty well as a technological interface. We don't need the visits and the annual body checks. You need a checkup from the neck up as much as you need a checkup from the neck down. And those should be the routines. The next time I go to my skin doctor, which I have eczema, I should be able to say to him, you know, I'm worried about the fact that my depression, and I take meds for depression, is getting out of hand and I'm itchier than ever. I wonder if there's a link. And he would be able to say, could be, let's set that up because my colleague, Dr. So-and-so, is part of this department and will help me make that judgment. So it's going to take new approaches. We're running out of time in terms of health, population health, in my opinion, and certainly mental health, for the same way we've been doing it up to now. It does not work.
Yeah, I look at that. I think of it like contractors working on a job. So you have individuals that are working on a house, and you have a plumber, you have a drywaller, you have an electrician, and medicine to me seems like it's all these contractors working separately. And the idea of integrating them all into one effort where they're all aware of each other. And I vividly remember an instance where I was working on a construction site, and there was someone who had come in and done some drywalling, and someone had come to do some plumbing, and they ripped out the drywall, and that left the drywall. And so the drywaller had to come back, and he was very frustrated because his work had been wrecked. And you see how this sort of patchwork model would not be efficient. And there's a lot of issues where, you know, someone's work is not being considered by another individual. And so I think we have to start to integrate everyone's health. And I know, for example, in many places in India, when you go to see a physician for any ailment, they start talking about your diet. They talk about, you know, how much sleep you're getting, you know, what's your daily life like, what's your work life like. And they're trying to create this broad view of you as an individual rather than just saying, here's a drug, take this, and good luck, you know, and manage it that way. It's trying to look back at the root cause and trying to identify ways to help you as a whole individual rather than looking with this pinhole view of you as just this one ailment.
I agree. And I think it's reached a point now where I, for one, if I get asked to go see a specialist, I sort of say, oh my goodness, because I know it's going to be 3 months or 2 months or something like that. And it's hard for people to function today. So it all boils down to me to a systematic approach to healthcare, and we don't have that. What we have is a piece of legislation that refers to medically necessary care as being paid for by government. That's it. And of course, drugs for older people like me, and which is great for me, but it is a system that is unable to respond flexibly, except in the ultimate emergencies with any promptness. Now it's going on 9 o'clock and I'm about ready to lay my head down. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
No, I enjoyed this, so I hope
we'll have to do it again.
Got something to work with.
Yeah, we'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, anytime.
Appreciate it, Joel.
Take care, Bruce.
Have a good night. Take care.
Good night.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. Please note that neither the host nor the guest have any undeclared conflicts of interest. Please visit novametricsinc.com for more information about the Canadian COVID collaboration.